everyone, this is Avani from Hedgecraft Heirlooms, and for the first time in 2 weeks, I think I am on both Facebook and Instagram at the same time again, which is wonderful, as I have had a terrible time trying to connect lately. So while we're waiting for folks to show up, I'm just going to pull up a second window on Facebook so I can make sure that I see. Hey, Trudy Astrology, we're here talking, you're going to be talking about living by the sun, talking about kind of the sun cults and why the sun is so important to the spiritual practice within the kind of pagan, Wiccan, witchcraft kind of pathway. I'm just in the middle of getting set up still, but if you're here watching, if you could throw a hashtag live into the comments, hashtag replay if you're watching on the replay, that will help the algorithm reach out and find other folks. And then once I get myself completely set up here, which is only going to take another couple seconds, on both like that, I'm going to leap right into my little pre-show, kind of like I kind of prepare a little extra stuff to talk about at the beginning while we wait for folks to show up, because otherwise people get bored and kind of take off. And I thought what we could talk a little bit about is some simple sun spells, just in general. So really quickly, things that the sun is generally associated with for magic. Hey Thriftical Magic, we're here talking about living by the sun today, so we have all this gold happening. And again, if you could throw a hashtag live into the comment, hashtag replay, especially if you are watching down here on Facebook. I'm glad I'm finally here with you guys live again. That'd be great, because Facebook doesn't show me names like Instagram does, and I want to be able to say hello. Because I like to, be friendly, because that's kind of what this is all about. It's about us being able to have a conversation. But let's talk a little bit about some simple sun spells. So the sun in general is usually within the context of the Wiccan, pagan, kind of spiritual system, I guess we could say, considered to be associated with the male aspect of divinity. Oh, hey Kelly on Facebook. Now, I will say that, of course, there are exceptions to that rule, so if you're over there tippy tapping on your keyboard like, wait, Avani, not everybody's like that. We know. I'm kind of generalizing here. Like, I certainly know that within the heathen community, generally the sun is considered female and the moon is considered male. Although I generally find that is not the majority, which, again, neither is right or wrong. It's entirely a matter of personal preference and what resonates most with you. I tend to resonate more with the idea of the moon as female and the sun as masculine. Hey Brokey, you're going to be talking about living by the sun today, in great part because to me, when I think about the moon and the cycles of the moon, how it kind of lines up with the menstrual cycle of women, to me it just feels very feminine. But that's just me. You do you. Your mileage may vary, as always. But the sun, in addition to being generally associated with the masculine aspect of divinity, is also associated with spells for health, vitality, healing, confidence, willpower, things like that. So just kind of as a general rule, like if those are things that you want to infuse into your magic in any way, shape, or form. Trudy says here that she also considers the moon feminine. Yes, and I would imagine that probably a lot of the folks that we end up talking to in here today are probably going to feel the same. In great part, maybe for the same reason. Tell me why you feel like that. Like, is your reasoning the same as mine? I would love to hear what your thought process is, but that's just been my kind of general feeling on it. I've been practicing since 2004, so I can't, that's 16 years, something like that. Irrelevant. The point is I've been at this for a little while, and that's just what felt right to me. So one of the ways that you can work with the energy of the sun is through the making of elixirs. Now, when you hear people talking about an elixir, first of all, a lot of people don't know what it means exactly, but they tend to associate it more with, oh, hey, Eda Taxidermist, we're here talking about living by the sun. I'm going to talk about the ancient pagan sun cult, why the sun is so important within the practice of paganism and witchcraft. But right now we're just doing a little pre-show where we're talking about simple sun spells, simple ways you can use the sun in magic. Elixirs are frequently talked about in relationship to working with gemstones. And it's sort of like creating a potion. Think of it as like, when we make tea, that's also called an infusion. You put the herbs in the tea and it steeps. Well, the idea of an elixir is the idea of doing the same thing, but effectively with a gemstone. So you're steeping a gemstone inside of water, and then the idea is that the water takes on the properties of that gemstone. I could talk at great length about that. In regards to safety issues, if you're out there, again, tippity tapping on your keyboard, being like, wait, Avani, there are some gemstones that you cannot or should not do a direct infusion. Hey, Queen Toad, so we're going to be talking about living by the sun today, as far as within paganism and witchcraft. There are certain stones that you should not use. As a good general rule, just really quickly without getting into too much detail, if a gemstone that you want to use is blue or green, you probably should not use it in an elixir because it probably has certain heavy metal content in it that is not good to be ingesting, especially if you're talking about taking in an elixir. But one of the things that is usually commonly done with elixirs specifically is that it is either set out in the moonlight. We think about the idea of moon water. Everyone's worked with that. But you can also make sun water, which is basically done the same way. You leave it out in the sun for a prescribed number of days or evenings, or not evenings necessarily, but days usually. And obviously we have to talk about with gemstones that there are certain gemstones that can bleach out in the sunlight, so you do have to be kind of careful with that. The ones that are usually the most susceptible are things like amethyst, citrine, fluorites, things that are sort of translucent sometimes are most susceptible to that. But there are lots that are not, that you can still use. And if you're only living out there for a little while, it probably will be okay, but I just want to throw that disclaimer out there in case you're like, but Ivani, I did what you said, and my citrine is white now. True astrology says that in astrology, the moon represents what we need emotionally, so I think women are generally more in touch with our emotions, and that's why I think the moon is feminine. And I would totally agree with that statement, too. We think about the ebb and flow and the tides and the way that, literally, speaking, the moon, impacts the earth, the as above, so below idea, which is a really big part of astrology. Now, I'm not an astrology expert in any way, shape, or form. The amount of numbers in it really intimidates me, but I am really interested in it. But the idea of the as above, so below is also really big in Hermeticism and alchemy, which are things that I have done some studying. But I know that Hermeticism, alchemy, and astrology and Kabbalah actually sort of go hand in hand, but I've only kind of studied one half of that to this point in my life, but I'll get there someday. So sun water, yeah. So I would say if you're thinking about making sun water, you can also make sun tea, where you actually do infuse herbs into water, but you do it outside at, whatever the ambient temperature is over a longer period of time, as opposed to getting really, really hot water. But as far as sun water or sun elixirs, I would say, one day, you want to leave it out during midday, ideally, because midday is when the sun is at its strongest, so when you're going to get the strongest energy, much like we often leave moon water out at the full moon, because that's when the full moon is believed to be at its most powerful, which is a whole other argument I don't want to get into, because I feel like, this is something I talk about in my Facebook group a lot, is I feel like, as far as moon phases go, that the full moon is actually the most masculine of the moon phases, because when we think about it astronomically, not astrologically necessarily, that the moon looks the way it does because it's reflecting the light of the sun. So when we see more light, it's because it's reflecting more sunlight, as opposed to the new moon. To me, I think is the most feminine of the moon phases. So I mean, more powerful is relative, but I don't want to dive too much into that. I just wanted to make a little note about it. But sun water, yes. So I would say, you could leave it out for one day. I would say, a full 24 hours, or even you could do 12 hours if you're really in a rush. I would say, for like sunrise to sunset, or a full 24 hours, or you could do 4 full days. I think it's great because to me the number 4 is very much like the number 13 is really big with the moon, or 3 or 9. To me, those are very sort of feminine, manifestation type of numbers. To me, I think the number 4 I associate, or number 7 I associate a lot with the sun. The number 4 because it relates to the 4 seasons, which has to do with the solar year, or the number 7, which has to do with the weekdays, which again has more to do with like solar timing. But that's just my personal opinion. So those are kind of some numbers that you might want to think about working with if you're thinking about making any sun water or even potentially sun tea. So if you're interested in either of those things, of course, you can Google it or DM me to ask more. But that said, let's get into what we actually came here for, which is talk about living by the sun. So the first thing I want to talk about, or one of the first things I always like to talk about in my live streams, is kind of talk first about history and the origin of things. Because if you haven't been following me for any great length of time, what I mainly do on my page is actually resell vintage and antique pieces to be reused for altar decor and ritual use. So to me, the idea of the history of pieces and where they come from and what they were for and what they were originally, used for is a big part of it. And to me, I feel like the very same thing is true within paganism and magic and witchcraft. So I always like to kind of start with history and then kind of move into how we can use that in the modern day. So let's talk about sun cult, because that's really what I want to talk about today, because I think it's a really fascinating subject. So there are a few different cultures that were are historically and anthropologically known to have sun cults within them in the ancient world. One of them was the Celts, which is appropriate for us to talk about because a lot of modern paganism and witchcraft and Wicca comes from ancient Celtic belief systems. That's evidenced in a lot of our holidays, which are named with Celtic words. Beltane, Samhain, Imbolc, I believe, is also Celtic, and Lunasar, Lammas. I'm sure one of those. I'm sure is Celtic. I'm not sure which, or Gaelic, I should say. But the Celts in particular were the first to record solar eclipses, which is really interesting. And we know that from finding and dating cave paintings and etchings. And in a site near that original cave painting that they saw, they discovered that there was a place where the sun illuminated a very special chamber within certain monuments on November 1st and February 2nd, which marked the halfway points between the solstices and the equinoxes. So again, we have Samhain and we have Imbolc, right? Yeah, Samhain and Imbolc. So those were very significant times for the Celts. It's interesting that wasn't Beltane, but Imbolc in particular became a very... Oh, my phone is heating up, so if my Instagram starts to get a little funky and kind of like pause this real quick, hang in there. It just needs to figure itself out. I promise I haven't actually gone anywhere. But that February 2nd did eventually become Imbolc, and Imbolc was a really, really big deal to the ancient Celts and even modern day Celts because it evolved or changed or was appropriated into St. Bridget's Day or St. Brede's Day. And Bridget was originally actually a solar or fire goddess within the ancient Celtic pantheon. And she was often associated with the sun, of course. And she was sort of, by many arguments, she was such a big figure within the ancient Celtic pagan belief system that the Christian church basically were not able to get rid of her, so to speak. So rather than trying to just, get her out of the way, they decided to canonize her and make her a saint so that people could still worship her and they could kind of not feel like they needed to freak out about people doing it. So they turned her into a saint so people could still work with her. It's a little more complicated than that. If you're interested in that, I believe at some point earlier this year, I know I did a video where I talked more about Bridget. It was probably back at Imbolc, so you can go back in my IGTV or on my YouTube if you're watching this on YouTube, because I'm going to be uploading this Instagram version to YouTube after the show, so to speak. But you can find more about that in previous videos as well. Other cultures that had sun cults were the Norse or the Germanic people. There was evidence of an ancient sun cult in Denmark as far back as 1500 BC. And archaeologists believe that the Danish island of Bornholm was once the site of a sun-worshipping temple complex over 5,500 years ago. The entrance to the complex was really interestingly aligned with the summer solstice. I don't know if any of you have ever seen Avatar: The Last Airbender, which, by the way, I absolutely love, but there is a significant part in the first or second season, I think it's the first season, where, oh, hey, Killian, we're here talking about living by the sun. We're just talking about some ancient sun cults in the ancient Celtic culture and now in the Norse Germanic historical cultures, ancient cultures, whatever you want to say. But there is that a part in Avatar: The Last Airbender where they're in this particular temple and they're waiting for the exact moment of the summer solstice to align so that something can happen. And sometimes when I read things like this, it makes me think of that, and it's just really cool. And I love the fact that idea has sort of persisted into the modern day and kind of permeated into pop culture as, being such a really interesting and magical thing. The idea of certain structures lining up with, astrological or astronomical events. So that's really fascinating. But anyway, I digress. The oldest known solar observatory actually is in Germany, and it's over 7,000 years old, and it was probably in use around 4,600 BC. So we're going way, way back here. Of course, in Britain as well, there were also some ancient sun cults. There were discs and artifacts that had been found by archaeologists to suggest sun worship, like gold discs and jewelry. And solar symbols were probably worn actually to denote status and wealth, and especially near Stonehenge. And I feel like I'm missing something here that I probably meant to include and forgot or lost, but that's okay. We have plenty of other content here. But Stonehenge, I was probably going to talk about how that also lines up with certain astronomical events too. I believe that is more the spring equinox. I'm sure someone out there knows more than I do. Someday I'm going to go there and I will really know that thing for sure. If you're here watching, because I've seen we have some other people joined us since the last time I said this. Hi, my name is Ivani. We're talking about living by the sun today. If you're here watching, if you could throw a hashtag live into the comments, that'd be great, especially if you're on Facebook so I can say hello. And of course, if you're watching on the replay, hashtag replay. It helps the algorithm do its job and find other folks that want to watch too and join us. Another really important, or I should say prolific, well-known sun cult. Hey Pratisha, we're here talking about living by the sun today. Another really prolific and well-known historical sun cult was in Egypt. You know, a lot of us know of, or at least have heard of, the Egyptian sun god Ra, which I have always just loved that. I just feel like it's a name that just kind of vibrates with a certain kind of power, chutzpah. Is that the word chutzpah? I'm not, I love it. I just think there's something really raw and powerful about it. But anyway, I digress. The cult of the sun god Ra became increasingly important until involved into the uncompromising monotheism of Pharaoh Akhenaten. I think I'm saying that correctly. Also known as Amenhotep IV, and that was in the mid 1300s BC. According to the cult, Ra created himself from a primeval mound in the shape of a pyramid and then created all other gods. So this is sort of interesting. So, hey Michelle, talking about living by the sun today, but this ancient sun cult in Egypt was sort of one of the first, primarily patriarchal mythologies that kind of started to crop up. The idea of a male deity creating himself as opposed to coming from the feminine. So thus Ra was not only the sun god, he was also the universe. Having created himself from himself, Ra was invoked as Aten, or the great disk that illuminated the world of the living and the dead. So it was a big deal. And even when we look back and we look at imagery of like ancient Egyptian deity, you'll see a lot of sun disks, even in goddesses. Like I think Hathor in particular has that sort of urn-shaped headdress, and there is a disc in it which represents the sun. So the sun was a really, really big deal. And the question then becomes, yes, the sun was a big deal. We get that Ivani. Why does it matter? Why was it a big deal? I think that's really what I wanted to. Sorry, I'm trying to readjust here because I feel like on Facebook I'm in like a weird place here. Now I'm lopsided. Shouldn't have touched it. So I feel like, let's talk about why it was important, because that's kind of really the bread and butter of this whole thing. Is like, yeah, cool, there were sun cults, but why? So the thing about the sun is that the sun really equaled life. If there was no sun, then there was no growing season. The sun then provided sustenance. The sun also heals sickness. It really was not a secret really early on that, exposure to sunlight and being in the outdoors helped people become healthier more quickly than they might have otherwise. Hey, Ivy Renee, we're here talking about living by the sun, talking about ancient sun cults and, why they existed. The other thing, too, is that the sun also had to do with the ability to work. If the weather, it wasn't like today where we have electricity and lots of indoor buildings where people could go and they could do things and be on their computer and work online. This was like hard, manual labor, and if the weather wasn't good, then work could not be done. So then the sun became associated with abundance and prosperity. And at a time when, again, electricity and indoor lighting didn't exist, that was crucially important. And especially in a lot of cultures, but especially in the North Germanic cultures, the solstices, especially the summer solstice, is a huge deal. There are tons of giant festivals that even to this day are actually still run as a celebration of the fact that the summer is here, the summer solstice is happening, and it had to do with in great part to do with the growing season. Yes, things are growing. We're gonna be able to eat for the year. We're gonna be able to eat for the winter, and the livestock will be able to eat, so we can, cull the livestock and butcher it and have that over the winter as well. So the sun really was a turning point. If there was no sun, then everything would cease to exist as far as they could tell. The other thing that even in the modern day that we kind of work with the sun Not quite in the way that our predecessors did or our ancestors did, but the wheel of the year that a lot of witches and pagans and folk kind of adhere to and work with is based on the solar year, and the cycles of the sun. I've always looked at and this is one of those really stray random things that I've kind of settled on that again, your mileage may vary, but I find that working with the moon and observing aspects or moon rituals for full new moon, and working with those cycles, to me again feels very feminine, very female, as opposed to working with the wheel of the year and with more solar holidays feels much more comparatively masculine. Now, of course, there is a lot of both, and this is just my personal experience, but I have been trying to make a commitment for about a couple of years now to really work with those moon cycles more than I did earlier in my journey in paganism and witchcraft. And it interests me to observe, and of course I'm sure they're not all like this, that my husband, who is a male witch, and has been long before I knew him even, has not much interest in moon rituals, and I wonder sometimes to myself if there is a correlation, but again, that's just my personal observation. Not everybody has the same experience. If you know any male witches that are really into working with the moon, let me know in the comments. I would love to hear about different folks, because obviously everyone's bubble is so small, so we're basing everything that we kind of work with spiritually and even in a mundane way on our own experiences. So I'd love to hear your experiences if your mileage has indeed varied. But so talking about the wheel of the year, going back to that, has to do in great part with the agricultural calendar and the growing and the harvesting and all of those sort of things, which were based around the sun and the seasons. So in spring things are planted, in summer things are growing and being harvested, in the fall the rest of the harvest happens, and in wintertime not much. things are hibernating. Things are dormant for the winter. So a lot of what we work on in the wheel of the year kind of lines up with all of those ideas that have to do with planting and agrarian culture. And again, I mentioned the concept earlier, the as above, so below. A lot of that, to me, that has to do with why we celebrate the wheel of the year. So when we talk about the idea of the growth cycle of the agricultural calendar, the idea is that the plants, the green things of the earth are the below in this situation. And we, as human beings, considered to be a higher form of life, are the above. And then, of course, there's another level where we are the below and the celestial bodies are the above. And I'm sure there's more layers above that, but very, very simplified here. So the idea is that by working with these cycles of the sun and the cycles of the agricultural growing cycle and schedule within the year, kind of echoes. Michelle says I do the same, sleep more during winter. I think we all do. And I find that, in wintertime, obviously, I don't want to go out as much. I just want to hang out in the house. I want to get cozy. I want to be on the couch. I want to watch TV. I want to read a book. And then in the summertime, there's some magical, invisible threshold, somewhere in early May where it's like someone flips a switch and it's like, let's go outside, let's go do stuff, let's go schedule a thing, let's go to the museum, let's go to the park, let's go hang out with family, let's go to a festival. So, and I feel that really hard. And I also notice that in more subtle ways personally, in the wintertime, I find myself, and today's not a great example, but in the wintertime, I find myself wanting to dress in darker colors, blacks and neutrals and grays. And then again, there's some invisible threshold where I'm like, woohoo, let's wear all of the color. And it gets almost borderline obnoxious. But yeah, so I definitely see little things in myself. And even the types of foods I eat also kind of vary from season to season, where I find that in summertime, I have much more of a desire to eat fresh foods, fresh produce, salads, things that are lighter. And then in wintertime, I tend to gravitate more towards heavier things that are fattier, things that are more meat heavy, if that's a thing that I'm eating at that particular point in time. So yeah, definitely I find myself, even in non-spiritual ways, although I think everything is kind of spiritual, in non-spiritual ways, I find myself as an as above, so below situation, kind of working with the seasons without even intending to necessarily, just as by being conscious and aware of my body and the things that I tend to gravitate towards and feel that I need at any given time to kind of be happy and comfortable within myself. So the other thing, let's see. So, but why, that was always the thing for me. It's like, okay, cool, we have these holidays, we observe them, we are lining up with the Wheel of the Year, but why? Like, what is the motive here? Like, why am I doing this thing other than because I read in a book somewhere that I'm supposed to? And this is the answer that I've kind of come around to in my own work and in my own understanding, is that the universe, that by lining up with those natural cycles that are happening both within us and within the external world, it allows us to work with those energies much more effectively. So if we're talking within a spiritual context, if I'm trying to spend the month of June doing internal meditative work, it's a lot more difficult in a way because there's so many things going on and everybody else wants to be active and busy. More difficult in June than it might be in, say, January, when there's really nothing happening and everyone's kind of hunkering down from the winter anyway. And then vice versa, if I want to go out and be active and do a ton of things in January, it's kind of hard because it's snowing, it's cold, there aren't really any things happening, because a lot of people kind of find themselves falling into that rhythm without even thinking about it. So on a very mundane level, but on a spiritual level, I feel like it's very much the same. And so by working within those energies, we can be much more efficient and we can do a more thorough job. The other thing too is I feel that, this is again personal thing, I think that the universe in a way, I believe in free will, so this is really getting kind of deep here, but I believe in free will, but I also believe hey East, we're here talking about living by the sun. We're talking a little bit about the Wheel of the Year and the why do we celebrate the Wheel of the Year and the value behind it. I believe in free will, but I think that the universe sort of lays out certain paths for us, and there's multiple paths, and every decision we make has those paths in front of us. And I think that some of them are more ideal than others. Some of them allow us to grow differently than others, or more easily than others. I think was a good way of putting that. And the universe obviously puts lots of signs and symbols in our way to kind of help us put on the paths that will allow us to kind of reach our destination with the least resistance, so to speak. I know it might not feel like it at any given time. And I think that I wrote here too that when we're on those paths that are laid out for us, it often seems as if things are too easy. And I've only really had that happen really once in my life where everything kind of really seemed too easy, and I knew I was really solidly on the path. But that's a really good sign that you're in the right place, and when things seem to be falling into place, in your path, without you putting that much effort into it, or so it might seem at the time, that's when you're on the path. That's one of those pathways that the universe has laid for you. And you really just have to be there to listen to the signs and the symbols and follow them. And I think that working within the Wheel of the Year and working within those energies, both within the sun, the solar cycles, and of course within the lunar cycles as well, to me I almost look like, and this is a really stray thought that just kind of came to me, we think about tarot, we have the major arcana, we have the minor arcana. People talk about the idea as the major arcana as the what, and the minor arcana as the how. And that's kind of how I feel about the solar versus the lunar cycles and working with them in them on a spiritual level. The sun is sort of the solar is sort of the major arcana. It's the big what's of what's going on, because it covers a much larger period of time. And the lunar cycles has more to do with the how, how from month to month and week to week we are doing to meet those larger goals, in a way. But the point is that I think that working within those energies is a way that we can most effectively reach our goals, ultimately. So I think that's really one of the big value points of working within the energies of the Wheel of the Year, and why it's so sort of important to find ways to observe those holidays and work within those energies in our own way. Again, that could be a group ritual, that could be solitary, it could be working on your fairy garden, it could be reading a book and eating chocolates and drinking a glass of wine at, next to your window at night. It doesn't have to be fancy. It's really about intention. Anything that's done with intention can be a ritual. But that is what I have about living by the sun today. The next thing that I like to do, well, first of all, is I'm going to do a little sign off, because when I upload this to Instagram, it will be really long if I leave everything else. So if you're watching on YouTube, if you're not watching on YouTube, of course, if you're here on Instagram or Facebook, hang out, because the next things we're going to be doing is I have a little mini curated live sale of some pieces from my shop that are specially priced extra low just for you folks that are here watching in real time today. And then, of course, after that, when we have time at the end, I will offer free one card tarot readings for the first 6 people that claim them. But first, I'm going to do my little sign off. So if you're here watching on YouTube, thank you so much for joining us for Living by the Sun. We're glad you could be here today. Join us next week when we're going to be talking about, remind me, a history of florals. I was supposed to do that a few weeks ago, and my personal life went a little sideways and it didn't quite happen. So we're going to pick it up again next week, a history of florals, especially as it relates to textiles and decor, which I'm really excited about, because there's actually a lot of really neat historical and magical information in there that I cannot wait to share. So I hope you guys take care, blessed be, and I'll see you next week. All right.